The following podcast is not meant for children or for liberals, even though that's pretty much the same thing these days, but that's what we're here for. Somebody's got to keep these brats in line. Anyway, you've been warned. It's the right opinion.
These days, our media's either incompetent or malevolent. They don't believe in heaven, but they acting like they heaven sent. Knowing the truth is way harder than telling it. We gotta work harder, gotta be more intelligent. Sometimes we just gotta grab a mic and start yelling shit. We're living in times when it's hard to stay relevant. Be the elephant in the room full of elephants. Be the elephant in the room full of elephants. Boom. It's the right opinion. Come on, y'all, step up into my dominion. It's the right opinion. Come on, y'all, step up into my dominion. It's the right opinion. Come on, y'all, step up into my dominion. Yeah, it's the right opinion. Come on, y'all, step up, let's go.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Right Opinion podcast right here on the rightopinion.podbean.com, also available on hackerhameen.podbean.com on a couple of days delay, but rest assured, the first Sunday of every month right here at the rightopinion.podbean.com, you can get the Right Opinion podcast once a month, and I do have to address a little bit of feedback I've gotten from some of you folks, and I do appreciate everybody who listened, who gave me feedback. If you dropped me a review, or you shared, or you liked, or you subscribed, all of that stuff, so very much appreciated. I'm gonna need you all out there doing the shares on a monthly basis, because I'm not inundating people's pod feeds basically with this show, right? It's only coming out once a month, and I understand that some of you want more of it, and I get it, and I appreciate it. The reason I'm doing it this way, couple of reasons, I suppose. One, to leave you wanting more, to leave you looking forward to that first Sunday of the month, so you could kind of put yourself in a mindset throughout the course of the month of these are the various stories that are breaking out. How is Harrison Bergeron going to piece them all together in such a way so that they all kind of fall into a much larger narrative? And I want to be able to do that. I don't want to just sit there and take every individual news piece and look at it for what it is, when we all know it's a bigger part of a bigger machine, and I want to be able to thread these things together. And I think that's what I've done for you this month. Also, in addition to leaving you wanting more and being able to compile a better body of work over the course of the month, it gives me the availability and the freedom and the time to come up with new and exciting segments and music and things like that, as you're going to hear this week. As a matter of fact, if you didn't notice already, we have new intro music because YouTube was not a huge fan of me using already existing copywritten music. When I posted this up to YouTube, it got yanked down right away because I was using the REM song and the Kanye West song. So I've made myself new music, new intro music. There's going to be a new parody song in the middle here, as well as some outro music, which is yet another parody song. So by giving myself a full month, I'm actually able to come up with this stuff that hopefully will entertain you, as opposed to trying to rush it out every week and provide you with lesser content. So the theme for the month of December right here on the rightopinion.podbean.com is lies. Liberal lies coming in all shapes and sizes and all forms, from all candidates, from all Congress people, from all media outlets, even from former presidents, and for that matter, just from your regular run-of-the-mill, everyday libtard on Twitter. We have a variety of lies to talk about, and I figured I'd start small, and then we'll work our way up to the really big ones. I'll throw some parody songs in there along the way for your entertainment, but I want to make sure I get all of these facts out there and break down all of the lies, because in a month since I've last spoken to you, there have been more lies bandied about on the internet, in the media, and in Democratic circles than I could even possibly keep track of. But I tried to keep track of as many of them as I could and group them into a variety of different smaller groups so that I can show you just how full of shit these people are. So let's start with the smallest of lies, Fartgate. Yes, Fartgate. First and foremost, we live in a society now to where anything happens, we throw a gate at the end of it. I'm waiting for Gate personally, and then hopefully that'll be the end of all this. But Eric Swalwell. Now, Mr. Smallwell appears on the various mainstream media outlets with somewhat regularity. He's up there, right up there with Adam Schiff, although not quite as visible as Adam Schiff, and not quite as memorable either, because he doesn't have that same melted Muppet face that Adam Schiff has. But Eric Swalwell also on MSNBC, on CNN all the time, spouting off all of these nonsensical, afactual, liberal talking points. And while he was doing this, he managed to also pass gas. Don't believe me? Here's the audio.
The evidence is uncontradicted that the president used taxpayer dollars to ask the Ukrainians to help him cheat an election.
Now, you may be asking yourself, well, where is the lie in all this? Well, the leftist media, in their inability to tell the truth about virtually anything, have covered for Eric Swalwell's flatulence in this particular case, and they made the claim that, I guess, Chris Matthews, who was the host of the show at the time, had dragged his mug across the desk in such a way to where it just so happened to perfectly make a farting noise, which Eric Swalwell's face correspondingly tightened up with. As that moment happened, it was quite obvious that the man passed gas on live television. And look, it's funny. It doesn't negate anything that he has to say. Like, unlike if this were a Republican, if this were Rudy Giuliani or Trump or Kellyanne Conway or whoever it was, immediately somehow everything that they've ever had to say would somehow be invalid because they passed gas on television. Eric Swalwell's comments are not invalid because he passed gas on television. They're invalid because they are afactual, liberal, dumbass talking points that really just have absolutely nothing to do with the reality that the rest of us live in. But look, they're willing to lie to you about Eric Swalwell, an otherwise uncharismatic, unremarkable human being, who you know, they probably could have all had a nice chuckle at this, but they take themselves so seriously that they needed to cover for this, and their cover was a mug sliding across a news desk. Mind you, I've watched hours upon hours upon hours of mainstream news coverage, and I have never once heard a mug slide across a desk and make a perfect fart noise. As a matter of fact, if it wasn't such terrible audio, I would try to recreate it for you right now. But again, it would be terrible audio, and there is no way I would ever possibly replicate the sound that clearly came out of Eric Swalwell's ass, as do his usual talking points more times than not. So that's the small lie. Like I said, we're going to start small. We're going to build up. Let's move on to what was the former frontrunner for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States in 2020, who is going to lose to Donald Trump in 2020. It looked like it was going to be Pocahontas for a period of time, but Pocahontas made the drastic error of actually telling the truth, which was, in this case, she kept being asked over and over again, how much is it going to cost for you to do your Medicare? Are you going to tax the middle class? Are you going to do this? Are you going to do that? Well, she had been badgered about it enough to where she actually released the numbers, and the numbers, not surprisingly, are completely ridiculous. It would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 trillion to enact her Medicare for All plan over the course of just the next 10 years. Mind you, our federal budget currently is at about $4 trillion. So we would have to dedicate the entirety of the budget plus 25% over the next 10 years just to Medicare and nothing else. No military, no Social Security, no this, no that, just straight up Medicare. So clearly, just in and of itself, on its face, the numbers don't add up. But then we're going to get into some of the more specifics here. But let's go back to some of the original lies from Elizabeth Warren, who is possibly the most disingenuous human being alive. And that's really hard to say because most of her colleagues are equally, or at least close to equally disingenuous. Let's start with the Indian heritage lie. Yes, as we all know, we call her Pocahontas because she claimed for years that she had been of Native American descent, right? Of indigenous people descent. This was the big lie. Charlemagne the God referred to her as like the new Rachel Dolezal, which is a perfectly apt description that was conspicuously brushed out of all headlines from all mainstream media outlets. But we have here in the show notes this week of Washington Free Beacon article, Elizabeth Warren scrubs DNA test from her Twitter. So you'll remember she claimed that she was of Native American heritage. She wrote a recipe in a Native American cookbook for what amounted to a crab bisque. She told Harvard that she was Native American. Harvard published articles about their first woman of color being on their staff, and of course they were referring to Pocahontas herself. And now, not even now, but over a year ago, she went and had the DNA test, and she thought that test had actually vindicated her accusations the entire time, when in actuality it showed that she was maybe 1 in 1,024th Native American. And that, technically speaking, isn't even accurate, because they don't have enough Native American blood on database or in databases in order for them to really truly measure one against the other. So they bring in a lot of Central and South American blood into there as kind of an equivalent, as a baseline for the Native American test. And so at best, she is 1,024th Native American, as we all know by now, right? But she was still pushing that narrative even after the DNA test had proven that she is in fact whiter than Slim Shady in the middle of a snowstorm drinking milk with some hockey players and an albino coke whore. She is white. She is really, really white. As a matter of fact, at the very least, she is 1,024ths whiter than all hell. So just to put this in a little bit of perspective, she got a job at Harvard. She was touted as the first woman of color. She was this and that. She was riding this thing for as long as humanly possible. Now, somebody in my family, my sister, as a matter of fact, took a DNA test not that long ago. She and I have the same parents. We're pretty sure. And it's more than likely that it looks like that she and I share some sort of Asian heritage along the way. 9%, according to the Ancestry.com survey. And the last I checked, neither of us got any royalty checks for crazy rich Asians. And that 9% in our blood, that is supposedly coming from an Asian bloodline, is about 90 to 100% more than the 1,024th of supposed Indian blood in Pocahontas's lineage. So yeah, it's pretty stupid, and it was a really dumb thing for her to ride with as long as she possibly could, and she kept riding it even though Trump was calling her out on it on every given availability, and eventually Trump was proven right and Elizabeth Warren was proven wrong. But that didn't stop her from continuing to lie about these sorts of things. As a matter of fact, as I pull up in my notes here, we have an article from The Federalist debunking her lie about being fired for being visibly pregnant. It turns out that minutes from the 1970 meeting of the New Jersey's Riverdale Board of Education show that Warren was actually unanimously approved for a second-term contract in 1970. Minutes from the meeting from the next year, 1971, show that Warren's resignation was accepted with regret. So not only was she not fired, she resigned, which obviously had nothing to do with the workplace's issues with her pregnancy, yet because she's a woman and she had run out of the woman of color card because she was called out for being a Native American, even though she wasn't really Native American. She was called out for being a fake Native American, I guess is probably the better way of putting it. Now she doubled down on the I'm a woman and I'm a victim of an evil male patriarchy who fired me because I was pregnant. Pause real quick. If you're not going to be around for the next 6 months to do your job, I don't care what the reason is. It doesn't matter what the reason is. Being pregnant, I know there's laws in place to protect against these sorts of things and yada, yada, yada. But just put yourself in the shoes of your boss or somebody who owns a business. I know in this case it was like a school, but pretend you run a business. You got 50 employees. You got one spot open. You're hiring people, right? 2 people come in the door. One is, let's say, a man who obviously cannot be pregnant, despite what the left tries to tell you, and the other is a woman who's showing. And they're both applying for a job that requires filling immediately. Well, why would you go out of your way to train the pregnant woman knowing that she is in all likelihood not going to be there in the next, 3, 6, 9 months, whatever the case may be, when you could train the guy who you know is not going to mysteriously disappear due to pregnancy? I know that this is a sucky reality for women, but it is a reality nonetheless. And there are plenty of women out there, not that I necessarily agree with their decisions, who have no plans on getting pregnant because they want to focus on their careers. By all means, as a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure those women probably wouldn't be great mothers anyway, if that's the type of decision that they're making. So please don't bring a child into this world only to neglect them. But the notion that Elizabeth Warren was fired for being pregnant, really just makes sense at the end of the day. Again, why would you pay somebody to do a job if they're not going to be around to do it? And B, is completely false. It is another liberal lie, which I hope will become a pattern by the time that we're done here. Now let's get down to the really dangerous lies that Elizabeth Warren is telling, because these are just to garner sympathy up to this point. But when she starts lying to you about policy, she starts lying to you about your taxes, your income, your wealth, your well-being, that's when it gets dangerous, because as frightening as it is, this woman is not that far away from being the president of the United States. Luckily, we've got a bad orange man in her way, but there are other people in the way as well. But she was the front runner here, which means it would have been her against Trump. And I think even at the best recollection right now, we're looking at a 50-50 election here. I'm confident Trump's going to win, but it really just comes down to a couple states and a couple counties, and it really just depends on where they go and what those people are thinking and what the voter turnout is. But let's get back into this. She keeps lying about how the rich don't pay their fair share, which, to be honest, is a lie not specific to Elizabeth Warren. It's virtually all of the current Democratic nominees, including billionaires Tom Steyer and Mike Bloomberg. But according to the taxfoundation.org, a summary of last year's federal income data from 2018, and I'm just going to read right from the article here, and I quote, all right, so the headline reads, "Taxpayers paid majority of federal income taxes. In 2016, the bottom 50% of taxpayers," and then that is represented by those with an adjusted gross income below $40,078, earned 11.6% of total AGI. This group of taxpayers paid $43.9 billion in taxes, or roughly 3% of all income in 2016. So those people in the bottom 50%, the people that Bernie's always talking about, the billionaires and the millionaires, they make the top 3 wealthiest people in this country make more than the bottom 50%. Well, yes, because when you're making below $40,000, you're essentially making nothing in the grand scheme of things. And when you make billions of dollars, you're making a whole lot more than $40,000. Like the math, I get what he's trying to prove there, but the math really just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's like comparing your child's piggy bank to your savings account. And it's unfortunate that we have to make a generational comparison there. But in a lot of cases, that's actually very appropriate. But in contrast, back to the article here, and I quote, "In contrast, the top 1% of all taxpayers with an adjusted gross income of $480,804 and above, they earned 19.7% of all AGI in 2016 and paid 37.7% of all federal income taxes." So 1% paying 37%, 50% paying 3%. Who's not paying their fair share, I ask again? It seems fairly obvious. Let's get back into 2016. The top 1% of taxpayers accounted for more income taxes paid than the bottom 90% combined. 90%. The top 1% of taxpayers paid roughly $538 billion, or as I previously mentioned, 37.3% of all income taxes, while the bottom 90% paid about $440 billion, or 30.5% of all income taxes. So the rich are paying a whole hell of a lot more than their fair share. Furthermore, let's say you're of the belief, let's say you're one of these people, you just don't like corporations. You don't think Bezos should be worth $150 million or $1 billion, and I agree with you, which is why I don't shop on Amazon. Stop giving them your money. If you're like upset with how wealthy these people are, it's really not that difficult of a concept. Tell your friends. Eventually, we can knock these people down a little bit. But if you're one of those nuts who's so like, oh no, Jeff Bezos shouldn't have that kind of money. We need to tax Jeff Bezos more. Okay, where is that money better spent? Is it better spent in the hands of Jeff Bezos, where he will likely open up a new warehouse, a new fulfillment center for Amazon, or open up a new Space Force, or whatever the hell he's got going on these days, where he's creating businesses, he's creating jobs, he's creating products and services that are available to you should you decide to give him your money, which he doesn't need. Or the alternative would be give it to the government, who, before they even spend a dime of it, are going to lose a certain percentage of it due to all the administrative costs that comes along with the government. Then there's regulatory stuff that they need to take into account. There's a lot of time that needs to be wasted getting things through the bureaucracy or through the legislature. A lot of that money is spent before any of the money is actually spent. So in and of itself, keeping that money in Jeff Bezos' pocket makes a whole lot more sense than handing it off to the government, who, A, never do anything better than the private sector, and B, don't know what the hell they're doing. They don't produce anything. Our government produces nothing other than the occasional job from expansion of existing programs that probably shouldn't exist in the first place, which only leads to a greater need for your taxpayer dollars so that they can open up more bureaucracies, so that they can dump your money into them and accomplish nothing, because that's what they do. So keeping the money in the hands of the business people is way better than keeping your money in Elizabeth Warren's hands, for instance. And last but not least, let's get into her taxing of the middle class, right? So she's been asked a litany of times throughout the course of the debates, what is this plan going to cost? How are you going to pay for this? And she kept giving well, it doesn't really matter because middle class people aren't going to get taxed, and they're actually going to pay less when it comes to, the rise in taxes versus the lowering of healthcare costs, yada, yada, yada. We heard the same line from Bernie Sanders for forever. No one believes them, because you couldn't possibly believe them, because the government, once more, never does anything right, and definitely doesn't do anything at the most efficient way of doing it. And of all the things to gamble with, your healthcare, nah, most people don't feel that. So taxing the middle class. This is an article from the Washington Examiner. It's an opinion piece. Elizabeth Warren's stubborn dishonesty on rising middle-class taxes. I got a couple of things here to help debunk this, but I'll read from the article. Essentially, she's trying to make the case that because middle-class Americans would be getting free health care, their costs would go down overall. But Senator Bernie Sanders, who actually, quote, wrote the damn bill she's endorsing, makes a similar argument about middle-class Americans being better off on net under his plan, without premiums, without deductibles, without co-pays, but he acknowledges that the middle class will still pay more in taxes. A little bit later on in the article, an analysis of the 2016 Sanders campaign proposal from the Liberal Urban Institute took into account that much of the $32 trillion price tag would result from the federal government absorbing many costs currently being paid by states and the private sector. But the analysis still found that the plan would increase overall health spending in the U.S. by $6.6 trillion over a decade. That's just the extra cost by trying to consolidate all of these different costs that are going out from the state and local governments. Now they would all come from the federal government. And that alone, mostly because of the administrative bureaucracy and all of the other nonsense that I mentioned before, is going to amount to an extra $6.6 trillion over the next decade. The largest revenue raiser Warren has proposed during her campaign is a $2.75 trillion wealth tax, or less than half of this amount. So it wouldn't even make up for the difference in moving everything to the federal level that Bernie wanted to propose, which is essentially the same policy that she's proposing, although somehow hers ended up being more expensive. I don't know. But back to the article. Put aside the fact that European countries have abandoned wealth taxes because they haven't worked, and that there is a significant reason for skepticism that it will raise as much money as promised. Warren has already pledged to use the wealth tax to pay for universal child care, universal pre-K, raising child care worker pay, free college, and canceling student loan debt. So she's not even just doing Medicare. She's giving you free school, free kindergarten, raising the child care cost, raising the cost of the pay of child care workers, giving you free college, and canceling any potential student loan debt that's currently out there. It might seem impossible to you, and that's probably because it is. Let's get back into the article. The clearest proof that middle-class taxes will go up is that the countries with socialized health insurance systems along the lines of what Warren is advocating have higher middle-class taxes than the U.S., and often national sales taxes or VAT taxes. And the article points out that these VAT taxes are especially punishing for those with lower incomes who have to spend most of their income in order to meet the tax, or at least to cover enough to pay the taxes to cover their share of this universal health care. Warren wants us to envy the social welfare systems of other countries while ignoring their tax systems, which is funny, especially since those systems are failing pretty spectacularly. As a matter of fact, found this article here from the Times, not the New York Times, the one based out in London. And the article reads, and I quote, and this is a problem that NHS spreads across the entirety of the United Kingdom, so this is a problem specific to the NHS in Scotland. An NHS operating theatre has been mothballed because of staff shortages, and patients having surgery are being taken to a mobile theater run by a private company. Wow, it's almost like they do things better. Anyway, the article continues, NHS Scotland is paying to transport people daily almost 40 miles from Aberdeen Royal Infirmary to have their operation at the temporary unit. One of the theaters in the hospital's general surgery suite has been shut down because the health board cannot find enough trained nurses to safely provide treatment there. Now, I mean, this simply cannot be, right? We've been told over and over again that big government provides the best medical care. The best, the greatest, the best. It's huge. Now, he's not saying that because he's not an idiot. But these folks seem to think that despite the fact that these systems have failed all around the world, that they've raised middle-class taxes all around the world, that they ultimately end up seeking the help of private companies because they do everything better than the government has and always will, because there's a profit incentive. There's no profit incentive with the government. These folks have managed to come up with ways of doing the surgery at a cheaper, safer, better environment and a better cost than the government of Scotland, of the United Kingdom's, generally were able to come up with here. Now, who'd have thunk that? Oh yeah, that's right. Anyone with a brain in their head. Mind you, this is just a small example, but one I figured I'd point out because it is relatively recent, as well as just before I move into the next set of lies here, let's talk about Elizabeth Warren's nonsensical cost to her Medicare. She claims that she's going to be able to generate $54 trillion in taxes over the next 10 years in order to cover her Medicare costs. This is physically impossible. Now, I mean, the ways that she wants to do it are ridiculous. The wealth tax, which is already immoral. The wealth tax is so immoral, in addition to the fact that it doesn't make a goddamn bit of sense. But let's talk about the morality of it for a second. Yes, I'm asking you to feel bad for billionaires for a second here, but these folks pay state tax, pay federal tax, they pay sales tax, they pay a fuck ton of sales tax too because they're the ones out there buying really expensive stuff, some of which are subject to a luxury tax. When they die, they'll ultimately pay a death tax as well as some other, fees and taxes all along the ways for all the various services that they use and that they provide for that matter. They open businesses, they're going to pay payroll tax, all of that. And now you want to add on top of that a wealth tax, which is not an income tax, it is a wealth tax. So they would have to somehow audit your entirety of your wealth. Let's pretend you're the billionaire here for a minute. Let's say you're worth $1 billion. Cool, even number, 1 billion. Every year, you would need to submit a tax return along with the ability to allow the IRS to audit your entire wealth. And that's not just your physical liquid earnings. That's not just your house. That's any businesses you own, any stock you own, even with unrealized gains, which for those of you unaware, unrealized gains are like if you bought a stock at $5, it goes up to $10, you have a $5 unrealized gain until you sell the stock. Now that could go away if you don't sell the stock when it's at its peak, but the unrealized gain is something that she would want to incorporate into your wealth, even though, as the name suggested, you haven't realized that wealth increase yet because you haven't sold the stock yet. So they want to incorporate all that. So here's a couple of things to keep in mind under the wealth taxes so far as why it wouldn't work. We've touched on the morality of it all. It will not work for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, in order for them to audit all of these people's money every year, they're going to need to audit the wealth, which is very much in flux with a lot of these people on a day-to-day basis. They're going to need to audit the wealth of every billionaire in the country and then based on that, take a tax of 2% over $50 million. So every dime that they own over $50 million, or I guess every dollar that they have over $50 million, the government will get 2 cents of. And in order to do this, we're going to, again, have to audit every aspect of these people's wealth every year. The administrative costs alone would outweigh the amount of money that would come back in taxes, as was illustrated by, I think, somebody from the Wall Street Journal this week. I'll see if I can find that article for the show notes for you. Furthermore, as of today, there are roughly 630 billionaires in the country of the United States of America. If you were to combine all of their wealth as it currently stands, it would equal a grand total of $9 trillion. So, if you were to tax 100% of their wealth, it would still only pay for 16% of Elizabeth Warren's Medicare plan. That's it. 1/6. That's all it would pay for. That's if you took every dime from every billionaire, it would only pay for that much. So, how is she going to do this without taxing the middle class? She not only did she say she wasn't going to touch the middle class, she said that she wasn't going to touch anybody who wasn't a billionaire, which means those 100 millionaires out there. That's why they didn't fall into my equation, because she says the only people who are going to really deal with this are billionaires. Well, I'm sorry to say that that's just false. Even if she could somehow do this without taxing the middle class, the quality of the service is going to be terrible, because much like the NHS in Scotland, you're not going to be able to find people who are going to want to do these jobs. Why would you go to medical school for 8 years, or school in a residency equivalent to 6 to 8 years, basically? Why would you do that? Put yourself at least $500,000 in debt to go work for the government, who is obviously not going to pay you as much as you would make on the private sector. Sure, you might get some nice vacation and some nice pension out of it, which I highly doubt, actually, because these people are still not going to be government employees. This is the difference between their nonsensical democratic socialism and real socialism, is that they're going to just regulate industries to the point to where they essentially own them and make all of their decisions for them. That's democratic socialism. True die-hard, dyed-in-the-wolf socialists would just actually seize the entire industry and call it the government's. They're pretending that they're not doing that because they don't want to actually own the businesses or own the industries, because then their names would be on it and would be attached to the dumpster fire it will inevitably be for all of history. No, they want to be democratic socialists. So you guys elect a bunch of idiots like AOC, and AOC is going to basically run your healthcare system. It's not socialist, it's a democratic socialist, because you got to pick the particular socialist who's running the socialist policy. It's all a bunch of nonsense. And I'm happy to say, although I am a little disheartened at my prognostication skills, that Elizabeth Warren is completely falling by the wayside as I speak right now. This letting everybody know what her plan was going to cost is a real problem for her, and she should have just kept lying about it. But now that the numbers are out there, the interest is waning. Bernie and Biden and Buttigieg seem to be the beneficiaries of that. Now, Mr. Buttigieg, who happens to be the next topic that I have here, he was accused by an author over at theroot.com, which is essentially like this race-baiting liberal, I guess it's a site designed for people of color, particularly black folks. The guy who wrote the article, I think his name is Michael Harriot, has gone on record saying that he wakes up every day and he looks at a picture of Pinky in the brain, and, the question is always the same: what are we going to do today, Pinky? And his response is always the same: F with white people. So, look, I'm not going to pretend white people are victims here. But then again, let's not pretend like this guy is some sort of arbiter for truth and justice out there. He just wants to F with white people. And so he writes articles like this. He has an issue with Pete Buttigieg for some reason. A black guy having an issue with a gay guy. It's almost like this is a pattern of some sort. Now, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but this is a large part of why Pete Buttigieg doesn't have a lot of black support. It's because he's gay. And not to suggest that the entirety of the black population in America are homophobic, but statistically speaking, they do tend to skew more that way, which is why he has zero black support. Now, in an attempt to garner some black support, Pete Buttigieg did turn out to be a lying motherfucker, which is what Michael Harriot had accused him of in his article, where he wrote this article out and it was just profanity laden and all this sort of stuff. And like, look, I know it's really hard for me to judge people for doing that. I'm on a podcast, like I'm trying to be entertaining. I'm trying to just speak off the cuff. He's writing an article. Like, if you want the article to be taken seriously, you should probably do a few proofreads and maybe get rid of some of the MFs and the this, that, and the other things in there. Again, I understand the hypocrisy of it. We're working in different mediums here. This is a black journalist who complains about the strife of black people, writing for a website that is nothing but a race-baiting, anti-white website that exists out in the ether there. If you want to be taken seriously, if blacks are victimized the way that you claim that they are, maybe not leaning into the stereotypes of like blacks are, uneducated and this, that, and the other thing. Again, not that I believe them, but those stereotypes are out there, right? That's, there's a whole swath of racist people out there who believe these sorts of things. If in fact you are the victim that you are and that you want to be taken seriously, like maybe just tone down the language a little bit and write like a coherent article, stating your case in a clear and professional manner. I mean, would it be that crazy to suggest that? Like, look, I'm not trying to be super professional here. I'm just trying to get the facts out to you in an entertaining fashion, trying to entertain you along the way. I like to talk like a normal person talks. Maybe he likes to write like a normal person talks, and that's fine, but you don't get to just jump onto the national stage and everybody suddenly take your journalism seriously when you're writing this opinion article that's just profanity laden and frankly comes off a little homophobic. I'm not going to lie. It just does. Anyway, so as Mayor Pete has risen in the polls, one thing has become perfectly clear, and that is that he desperately needs to get some of this black vote, or he is going to just completely fall by the wayside, right? I mean, Biden's got a fair amount of it. Bernie's got a little bit of it. Kamala Harris and Cory Booker certainly have some of it. Pete Buttigieg has none of it. He needs to desperately get his hooks into that demographic and start pulling some votes over his way, or he's going to be just like Elizabeth Warren 2.0, except gayer. So his answer to all of this is something he likes to call the Douglas Plan, weirdly enough named for Republican abolitionist Frederick Douglass, focused on attacking systematic racism in America. Now, being that there is no actual systematic racism in modern-day America, as a matter of fact, there's plenty of laws and institutions dedicated to the opposite of that, but neither here nor there. I'm sure his plan will work wonders to fix this non-existent problem, but the whole idea here was for him to put out this Douglas Plan, write an olive branch to the African-American community. And in order to show that he was gaining some black support, his campaign did a email poll about this plan. Now, the poll provided a copy of the Douglas Plan and gave readers the option to opt out if they didn't support it. Now, that's disingenuous enough, right? It's not that you approve the plan, it's that you didn't opt out of the plan. So everyone who got the email would have had to opt out of it if they didn't like the plan, which means that everybody got the email by default had opted into it and had approved of it according to the way that this particular thing was laid out. Now, here's the real kicker. Of the 422 names on the list of people that supposedly supported this plan, who again may have just been people who deleted the email or just neglected to opt out, not realizing that they needed to opt out, of the 422 names on the list, only 297 of them could be verified when checked against the South Carolina voter file, because apparently this was a poll done exclusively in South Carolina, because that's where the big primary is that's coming up that will be affected largely by the black vote. I believe the Democratic base down in South Carolina is like 60% of the black vote. So, or 60% of their base in that area is black men and women out there voting. So, again, 422 names on the list. Only 297 of them could even be verified against the South Carolina voter file, and 184 of those people are white. Yep. This plan that was supposed to go out to nothing but an African-American audience in order for them to opt in by not opting out, I guess, for this plan, it turns out that almost 2/3 of the people that could be verified, which is almost half of the people they suggested in the first place, are actually white. Now, you see a lot of the memes online of the white folks wearing the Blacks for Trump t-shirts, and frankly, if they're giving away a free t-shirt, I'd be throwing on a Blacks for Trump t-shirt like without even thinking about it. Not trying to, troll anybody. It's a free t-shirt. Who cares? Wear the shirt. Support your president. Who cares? We're not the party that cares about what race you are. That's them. So that said, Pete Buttigieg just falling flat on his face with this whole thing. Now, the campaign did not specifically state that all of the supporters were black, but it was obviously very strongly implied when you're showing that you want to try to garner black support. You've got this plan to try to help racism in America and yada, yada, yada. Here's how they managed to imply it. The results of the poll were actually published by Historically Black College and University Times, HBCU. The bylines and supporters listed in the article with the polls, with the poll results, were all black. And here's the real kicker, is that the campaign actually used a stock photo of a mother and child from Kenya on the website for the plan. Those pictures have since been removed from the website, which is kind of funny, but they were just using stock Getty images of just a mother and a son from Kenya to show, that this plan is for black people. So rather than, walk outside and take a picture of two black people that which maybe he doesn't know many of them, or, any two black people who might support you, just taking the picture there, putting it up on the website, they used a Getty image of a family from Kenya. Not good. Imagine the Trump campaign did something like that. We'd never hear the end of it until the next thing that we'd never hear the end of. So last but not least, I think it's pretty much safe to say that he's about as honest when it comes to his support from the black community as he is straight. Anyway, let's get into some other lies here, because Mayor Pete is a lying MF-er, according to Michael Harriot, and I think we agree on that point, but everything else I think we would probably vehemently disagree on. Mr. Harriot, if this ever gets to you, you are more than welcome to come onto the program and debate me at any given time. Anyway, moving on. They even lie to themselves, folks. The liberals, the media, the Democrats, the libtards on Twitter, they're all just one big hive mind, basically. They even lie to themselves, even when one of their golden calves is trying to warn them against their own destruction. Yes, Barack Obama has been out. He has emerged from his sabbatical, from his hibernation, his political hibernation at least, and he came out to tell the people of the left, like, look, guys, look, folks, we're going a little too far to the left. We need to reevaluate. We need to reconsider what we're doing here. And that's my Obama. It's not great. But when he tells you you're too far to the left, Barack Obama, who is probably the leftmost president in modern memory, when he's telling you you're moving too far to the left, listen to him. But they won't. They won't even listen to him. They've gone so crazy with their Trump derangement syndrome. They hate Trump infinitely more than they ever liked Obama. And it kills them that this bad orange man can evoke such a reaction from them. Their golden calf, their wonderful hero, big old 44 himself. Everybody loved Barack Obama. He was the greatest. He was just out there. You want to have a beer with the guy. You want to pick your bracket with him for March Madness. Everybody liked this guy up until he showed up and said, guys, we're moving too far to the left. And then the Washington Post wrote an op-ed called Barack Obama a conservative, which to them is like the worst thing you could possibly call somebody. But when Barack Obama is telling you you're too far left, you should probably listen to him. Nope, they'll lie to themselves despite their own self-interest. Barack actually said, even as we push the envelope and we are bold in our vision, we also have to be rooted in reality. The average American doesn't think we have to completely tear down the system and remake it. And this is, of course, one of those rare occasions where I 100% agree with Barack Obama. Yeah, don't tell my family. But they won't take his warning. They won't. They refuse to believe that they are going too far to the left. Now, it's clearly not for lack of information. I mean, just watch the debates. These folks aren't exactly hiding their crazy leftism. It's simply for lack of willingness to accept that information, and that's a problem that the Democrats have more broadly on pretty much every subject, because Democrats are incapable of telling the truth, even to themselves. They are too far to the left. It is as clear as day to anybody who's paying attention, and yet they continue to push to the left, and they continue to ignore the advice of people who are actually looking out for their best interests, including their Lord and Savior Barack Obama. But the most dangerous lies of them all are the ones that they believe wholeheartedly and wildly hypocritically, which brings me, of course, to Nancy Pelosi. Yes, Nancy Pelosi, she is just an awful person. I really can't tell if she's just out of it or if she's really just evil. Maybe she's a little drunk too, who knows? But Nancy Pelosi thinks that it's dangerous. And that's a quote, dangerous. She thinks it's dangerous for you and me to decide who will be the president in 2020. And that's bad enough, except for the fact that the media just outright lies and says that her quote was taken out of context from the Washington Post, the opinion piece, the plumb line, whatever that might mean. How a mangled Nancy Pelosi quote illustrates the Ukraine scandal. So the author goes on to basically try to debunk Donald Trump's tweet of what Nancy Pelosi said. So Trump tweets out, Nancy Pelosi just stated, and I quote, "It is dangerous to let the voters decide Trump's fate," end quote, at Fox News. In other words, she thinks I'm going to win and doesn't want to take a chance on letting the voters decide. Like Al Green, she wants to change our voting system. Wow, she's crazy. Crazy was in all caps, and I agree, Mr. President, as usual. So this guy is somehow suggesting that Nancy Pelosi did not say that it was dangerous to let you decide who's going to be your next president. And here it is. According to the Washington Examiner, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi told fellow Democrats, and this was in the form of a memo, that it would be, quote, dangerous to skip impeachment and wait for the 2020 election to determine whether President Trump should remain in office. And then here's a longer quote from her. And I quote, "The dangerous position only adds to the urgency of our action because the president is jeopardizing the integrity of the 2020 elections," end quote. The California lawmaker said to fellow Democrats in a memo sent on Monday. Pelosi said the call to skip impeachment proceedings and let voters decide next year is, quote, the weak response, end quote, to the hearings Democrats have been holding as a part of the impeachment proceedings. So she thinks that Trump is the one who is jeopardizing the integrity of the 2020 elections. It's definitely not her and her partisan group of hacks who are pushing an impeachment hoax, which is a hoax because there is nothing impeachable going on in that phone call with the Ukraine, or for that matter, the White House more broadly, as I will get to in just a little bit when we go to debunk all of the impeachment stuff. But Nancy Pelosi, man, she thinks, and mind you, this is the same Nancy Pelosi who, like many of her Democrat colleagues, have been sitting around going, Trump is endangering our democracy. She doesn't even want you to have a chance to vote to decide who is going to be our president. She wants to decide who's going to be your president. And if it were up to her, they would impeach Trump and Pence tomorrow, and guess who would be president? Her. Yeah, I know, it's scary. We are 2 heart attacks away from full-on hellscape here in the United States, but let's be grateful that the Donald's in great shape for a portly man, according to our doctors, and he's all good to go, and he's going to be fine. He most certainly moves better than most guys his size and his age. He seems to never need sleep. I'm sure the rumors of an Adderall addiction or whatever the case may be are rampant all across the internet. This is a guy who doesn't even drink alcohol, though, so I find it really hard to believe that he's sucking down a whole bunch of pharmaceutical uppers. Just, I don't know, call me crazy. Just don't call me Nancy Pelosi, who is, like the president said in that tweet, all caps, crazy. So it sounds an awful lot like she just doesn't trust the American people to make these decisions for themselves. She, Queen Nancy, is now taking the throne and the crown away from Queen Kamala, apparently, and she wants to be your evil authoritarian dictator. And there are people out there, and I'm one of them at times. It's hard to keep track with Nancy Pelosi because it's like I don't know if she's evil, if she's stupid, if she's drunk, if she's just losing it. Like maybe it's some combination of all of them at a given point in time. But when you outright say stuff like it's dangerous to let the American people decide the fate of our president, that's dangerous. That's actually dangerous. She's the Speaker of the House. Like I said, she's 2 heart attacks away from being the president of the United States right now. God forbid something should happen to Pence and Trump. She's in charge, and she thinks it's dangerous for you to cast a vote and decide who your president's going to be. Talk about a threat to our democracy. You're looking at it, and it's some bobble-headed, half-drunk, liver-spotted freak from California named Nancy Pelosi. And it's hilarious to me that this is what Nancy Pelosi thinks of the voters, and these people still vote for her. She thinks you're too dumb to make this decision for yourself, and there are people lining up in California to vote for her again. Or at least there will be, and have been since like the 60s. This woman has been in office forever. And I don't know that it's necessarily the 60s, but it feels like it, doesn't it? I mean, we know she was involved with JFK in some way, shape, or form back in the day, but none of that has been fully corroborated. It's just a rumor, folks. Just throwing it out there. Anyway, she's also been part of this concerted effort to shift the narrative a little bit for the Dems. Have you noticed they've stopped using the word quid pro quo quite as much? And they've started just using outright bribery? Well, lucky you, because that probably means you haven't been watching a lot of the mainstream media news coverage, but here's a quick compilation, I guess, of the media in live time shifting from quid pro quo to bribery. Here it is.
A lot of the initial messaging in all of this uproar involved the words quid pro quo. Do Democrats, Congresswomen, need to fine-tune their language?
Why does everyone keep saying quid pro quo?
Yeah, who the hell knows what that means, right?
People don't get quid pro quo.
Which one is hard to say very quickly.
Quid pro quo might be too complicated.
And two, might get lost on some people.
I mean, it's like an SAT word.
Quid pro quo, people may not understand.
How dangerous can these hearings be for Democrats if they can't get the public to understand what happened?
Please stop saying quid pro quo.
Enough with the Latin. What Trump did was bribery.
It's not about a quid pro quo. Bribery.
Stay away from the sort of legalistic Latin arguments we've heard.
Don't use the Latin.
Don't use the Latin.
Just use the word bribery
instead of quid pro quo.
Yeah. Instead of the quid pro quo.
The devastating testimony corroborated evidence of bribery. Quid pro quo, bribery. Bribery.
Bribery is, for the public at large, easier to understand than quid pro quo.
This is the first time Speaker Pelosi has made the specific bribery case against Donald Trump. And several other key Democrats have also recently discussed bribery as the article of impeachment that they may lead with against Donald Trump. So this is all brand new this week.
And why are they doing this? Well, they're doing this for a few reasons. Number one, they're doing this because they think you're too stupid to understand what a quid pro quo means. You must not be getting what we're trying to say here. It was a quid pro quo, guys. Donald Trump quid pro quo'd the folks over Ukraine. You don't get it? Maybe we got to come up with a simpler word for you freaking idiots to figure out, because apparently the Democrats think everyone's stupid. I literally tried this as an exercise. My 11-year-old daughter, I was able to explain to her what a quid pro quo was in less than a minute, and she understood it. So clearly, she thinks, Nancy Pelosi and her colleagues in the Democratic Party, they think you're not even as smart as an 11-year-old. And now, mind you, my kid's a particularly smart 11-year-old. No real surprise there, I'm sure. But having said that, this is something a child can understand with minimal explanation. It is not because you're not understanding the Latin. It is because you're not understanding the charges, because you know what quid pro quo means, and that's not what happened on that phone call. You can read the transcript. Number two, they actually polled different terms to see which would get a more visceral reaction from their dumbass voter base, and bribery won the poll. This is actually according to the Washington Post. They legitimately did like a poll amongst voters in the Midwest to see which one of those would try to coax a more emotional reaction out of those folks, because they're trying to flip them into Democrat voters for 2020. Good luck with that, folks. Number three, and this is a big one, is that the Constitution itself uses the word bribery in and around the actual clause that mentions impeachment. So it says in the Constitution, and I quote, impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So bribery specifically mentioned in there. Now, they didn't want to go all out and allege bribery from the beginning, right? Because that would have been kind of going out ahead of their skis a little bit. It's a little strong. It's a little on the nose, and considering the evidence that they had for the supposed bribery, it was going to be way too bold of a claim. So they used quid pro quo, right? Because their voter base isn't smart enough to understand it. And obviously those rednecks out in the middle of the country, that those flyover state Republicans couldn't possibly understand what a quid pro quo is, right? Well, Looks like everybody's figured it out except for them, because they continue to point to something that was not bribery or not a quid pro quo and say that it is bribery and a quid pro quo, and then they think that you don't get it because you don't understand the terminology. But it specifically says bribery in the Constitution, and we've been out here talking about this quid pro quo for so long now that people, even though they don't understand that it's bribery, the leap from quid pro quo to bribery is much shorter from nothing to bribery. So now that we've already kind of gone halfway down this road, we might as well just roll with it. It's bribery now. That's it. It's just bribery. That's the only way that we're going to get these dumb-ass Americans to figure it out, the people who it would be dangerous to leave the decision for who is the president in 2020 in their hands, because they're so dumb. They don't understand these simple Latin terms that they were, taught back in, middle school. Like, seriously, I've known what a quid pro quo was since, I was a teenager at the very latest. It's really not that difficult of a concept. They just can't seem, rather than identify the fact that their story is stupid and that their facts are non-existent, they think you're dumb. That's what it is. No, you must not get it. You must be one of those Fox News watchers or whatever it is. They think you're dumb, and then they want you to vote for them. Why? Why would I vote for somebody who thinks I'm an idiot? I mean, maybe Trump thinks I'm an idiot. I don't know. It's possible, but he's never outright stated it like these idiots do. And they're actual idiots because they think this sort of stuff is going to work. Meanwhile, let's go ahead. Let's get into the big stuff, right? The real big stuff, the impeachment stuff. But first, I've already beat you over the head with an hour worth of liberal lies. I think we need a little bit of a break. Let's take a musical break at that. And this kind of segues perfectly into the impeachment lies segment. This is a parody song by yours truly. For those of you who are Kid Cudi fans, or maybe even Lady Gaga fans, Kid Cudi did a version of a song called Poker Face by Lady Gaga. He edited it, made a song called Make Her Say, and then I took that beat and created this song for you. Ladies and gentlemen, the first parody song from the Right Opinion podcast, I give to you, No Quid Pro Quo. We'll be right back and breaking down all the impeachment lies right here on the rightopinion.podbean.com right after this.
No, quid pro quo, no, quid pro quo.
It's plain to see.
No, quid pro quo, no, quid pro quo.
Let's go. The Democrats are telling you lies, them and their media friends. So come over here to the Right Opinion. Yeah, Trump asked a question about Hunter Biden. If he ain't did nothing wrong, man, what's he hiding? Remember, that's what they said about the Russia shit. Never mind his creepy old man's out here sniffing kids. His luck would have it, William Barr's on the cases. The clowns on the hill ain't nothing but disgraces. Fuck Fredo and the rest of CNN's faces. Get out and vote red, we need to win all the races. This isn't an impeachment, just a bunch of atheists trying to become preachers now. It'll never get past the Senate, it's all a fucking show, and the people starting to get it like
No, quid pro quo, no, quid pro quo. No, quid pro quo, no, quid pro quo.
Alright. Zelensky already denied there was any pressure on that call. No deal for foreign aid, and that's all. What'd she say? Mario Yovanovitch, just another blase for a whiny bitch. She got canned, now she's on the stand trying to take down the bad orange man. And Shifty Schiff can't hide his erection. I wonder if he knows they can't win the election. Maybe he is thinking that this little deflection will end up being a Democrat resurrection. But I gotta really question, you think they've even taken a second to question their selections, or if they've ever seen the reflections? I hope they're ready for another massive rejection like
No, quid pro quo, no, quid pro quo. No, quid pro quo, no, quid pro quo. No, quid pro quo, no, quid pro quo. No, quid pro quo, no, quid pro quo.
Can impeach, you can impeach my president. He's
can't impeach, no, you can't impeach my president, and he's winning 2020. Can't impeach, no, you can't impeach my president, and he's winning 2020. Can't impeach, no, you can't impeach my president, and he's winning 2020. All right. So, as we dive into all the impeachment lies here, it's an important thing to remember what the initial assertion was from the Democrats, specifically from Adam Schiff. Adam Schiff's assertion was that Donald Trump definitely withheld military aid to blackmail Ukraine into doing his political bidding. That, and precisely that, is the reason that there is an impeachment hearing. That is what Adam Schiff would have you believe, but this is obviously the same clown who said that he saw more than circumstantial evidence that Trump and his team had actively colluded with the Russians, but we are still waiting to see that information, and yet people are still taking him seriously. Now ask yourselves, if the Democrats were a serious group of people, wouldn't you want to opt to move this clown off of important committees, or at the very least replace him as the head of the committee that's running the impeachment investigation, considering what a joke he's made of himself up to this point? Yes, of course you would, but you're not a Democrat. Probably not. You're listening to this show. The guy's just bad at his job. He took a big swing and he missed in a big spot, and hey, at the very least, like if this was like a baseball team, you'd move him down the order a little bit in this loose baseball analogy that I'm now making. But why is he at the center of the impeachment circus? Well, it's because the stupid, transparently false propaganda that he's spewing on CNN and other places is on brand for the Democrats. It's not that he's speaking out of turn. This is exactly what the party as a whole wants you to believe. And for some reason, they were unable to find anybody who's actually remotely convincing and isn't completely, pardon the pun, full of Schiff. So before we even dive into some of the specifics here, the big lie around which all of these other lies have been built up to this point is Adam Schiff's insistence that the whistleblower has the right to anonymity, which is simply false. It's not a real thing. There's only one person who is actually obligated to keep the whistleblower's name anonymous, and anybody else who should stumble upon it has more than enough right to reveal it to the world, including, yes, even Donald Trump Jr., who tweeted out an article with the guy's name in the headline and apparently was outing the whistleblower, despite the fact that, again, the guy's name was in the headline of the Breitbart article that he had posted out there. Just because the left doesn't read Breitbart doesn't mean that nothing that they ever produce is true. Anyway, the Washington Examiner's Jerry Dunleavy breaks down this whole notion, and I quote from his article from the Washington Examiner. The Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act establishes rules for whistleblowers to report on waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption in a lawful manner, and it, along with the presidential directives, provides legal protections against reprisals and punishment. Anonymity, however, is not one of those guarantees. The article goes on to say there is no language in the statute as written or amended that gives a whistleblower from the intelligence community the statutory right to anonymity, so says Cully Stimson, a former Pentagon official and the head of the Heritage Foundation's National Security Law Program, told the Washington Examiner. He goes on to say, that's separate and distinct from whether Congress wants to make the decision to provide the name. That's at the discretion of the chairman. So the chairman in this case is Adam Schiff, and he has made that decision to try to hide the whistleblower's identity, even though it's an open secret now. Everybody knows that the whistleblower's name is Eric Ciaramella, and you can look it up, and he's got quite a few ties to a whole litany of deep staters, John Brennan being the chief amongst them, who supposedly handpicked him for the position that he was in for the express purpose of keeping an eye on the president for the deep state. Anyway, the article goes on to state that Intelligence Community Inspector General Michael Atkinson, who received the whistleblower's complaint in August, has said he must keep the whistleblower's name secret, but it does not appear his legal prohibition extends to President Trump, his allies, or anyone else. So the whistleblower is not, there is no anonymity guaranteed to him by anyone other then the Intelligence Community Inspector General, the ICIG, Michael Atkinson, who received the complaint, as is part of the procedure, he needs to keep the whistleblower's name secret, but no one else does. So once you know who the whistleblower is, you can, quote, out them if you'd like, as many people have done thus far. That gets us into the impeachment and to the various testimonies that took place, that every one of them seemed to be a bombshell, damning testimony, the final nail in the coffin of the Trump administration if you were to listen to the mainstream media, which I hope most of you do not at this point. Anyway, so let's start off with Tim Morrison. Mr. Morrison is a former national security advisor on Ukraine and Russia relations, and he was appointed by President Trump and had resigned as of Halloween of 2019 this year. So he was on the stand. He was first on the stand. It's not really a stand. It's not like a conventional court or anything like that, but he was there to testify. First behind closed doors, and then in the open hearing that we all saw a week or two ago. In the closed-door testimony, GOP counsel Steve Castor, who's asking a lot of the questions on behalf of the Republicans, asks Morrison about Trump's hesitance to release foreign aid. Now remember, the claim is that the foreign aid wasn't being released as some sort of blackmail, some sort of ultimatum to the Ukrainians to say, hey, do this or you're not getting your military aid, when we've all known for at least 3-4 years now at this point that Donald Trump is not particularly keen on giving out foreign aid willy-nilly. This was part of his campaign. It's part of why he got elected. But Mr. Morrison is able to testify to some of that here. So the question, and I'm going to read right from the transcript here. The questions are coming from GOP counsel Steve Castor, and the answers are coming from Tim Morrison. So I'm just going to kind of go question-answer here. Question. Was the president positive at the point, or was he still skeptical? This is in relation to giving out the military aid, and Mr. Morrison responded, still skeptical. Question, was the president's skepticism in part based on our allies, their support of Ukraine financially? Answer from Mr. Morrison, yes. Question, okay. So he was still concerned that our allies could do more. Morrison says yes. And he was still concerned by his general issue with using U.S. taxpayer dollars overseas. Response from Mr. Morrison, to the best of my understanding. Question from Mr. Castor, during the Warsaw visit, Ambassador Sondland, I guess, had a sidebar with Yermak, who is one of the Ukrainian officials. As a matter of fact, Tim Morrison responds, yes, Ukrainian presidential advisor Yermak. The question from Castor comes, did you witness that exchange? And he says, I witnessed it, yes. Okay. And were you part of the exchange, or did you just see it occur? He says, I saw it occur. Okay. What did you learn about the exchange? I guess Ambassador Sondland told you what he told Yermak, ? He says he he essentially walked across, I don't know how to describe the room. This is a direct quote from Morrison. He goes on to say that he walked across the space and he briefed me on what he said. He said to Mr. Yermak, and the question comes back, what did he tell you? He says, well, he told me in his... Then he kind of stumbles a little bit, and he says that what he communicated was that he believed and then he kind of stumbles a little bit, what could help them move the aid was if the prosecutor general would go to the mic and announce that he was opening the Burisma investigation. And the question back from GOP counselor Castor, he says, and this occurred after the vice president's meeting? He says, yes. So the vice president had just met with President Zelensky? He says, yes. And the word Burisma didn't come up? And he says, no. And Mr. Castor says, are you going to interrupt me? And then Mr. Bitar, who I guess is the counselor for Mr. Morrison, had interrupted the line of question. He says, no, just for the record, when the witness mentioned Burisma, he put quotation marks in the air, and I just wanted to make sure that that's in the record. Mr. Morrison said, I meant by that the Burisma bucket. So I guess not specifically anything about Biden or whatever, but just Burisma as a whole. Mr. Bitar, the counselor for the witness, says, understood, thank you. Mr. Castor said, sorry, I didn't mean to. There was a whole kind of awkward exchange here between the attorneys who were very apologetic about stepping on each other's toes. And then we get back to Mr. Castor, who gets back into the questioning, and he says, getting back to the vice president's meeting, the word Burisma didn't come up in it? He says, it did not. He says, the name Biden, was it mentioned? He said, it was not. Whether Hunter Biden or former Vice President Biden? He says, no form of Biden. He said, was the word CrowdStrike, did that come up? He says, it did not. He says, any specific investigation? He says, no, not to the best of my recollection. And it continues on from there. So he initially claimed, now this is Tim Morrison, who was not involved in the original conversation. He says that he spoke to Sondland, who spoke to Yermak, who is the advisor to the Ukrainian president, saying, like, hey, if you guys, if you announce this investigation, we might be able to get that aid released for you. And as we will find out later on in Mr. Sondland's testimony, all of that was based on a presumption by Sondland that that was the case, and never at any point any direct knowledge or instruction from the president or anybody in the executive branch. Then, continuing on with Mr. Morrison here, he's later questioned by Representative John Ratcliffe, who did his own questioning because he's a lawyer, and he was asking specifically about Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and his credibility. And here, this is where it gets really interesting. So, in short, this is Ratcliffe speaking. So in short, your testimony today is consistent with what Ambassador Taylor testified to me under oath, which is that the Ukrainians had no knowledge that any security assistance might be withheld until around August 28th of 2019. That's inconsistent with what Colonel Vindman told us yesterday in his testimony. He testified that in mid-August, and then he was cut off by the chairman, who in this case is Adam Schiff. He says, Counselor, is there a question for the witness? Mr. Ratcliffe says there is. The chairman says, because you're reading testimony from other witnesses, and Mr. Ratcliffe says, I'll get to my question. And the chairman, once again, Mr. Schiff, he says, and making representations about whether they're conflicting or not conflicting, Mr. Ratcliffe says, I'll get to my question, Chairman. And the chairman says, thank you, counsel. Mr. Ratcliffe says, you bet. He goes, my question was, if there were light queries from the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian officials to Colonel Vindman about the withholding of security aid or military aid in mid-August, is that something that you should have been reported to, you, Mr. Morrison, that is? And he says, yes. And Mr. Ratcliffe says, so he did not report that. And he says, I have no recollection of him doing so. Mr. Ratcliffe says, if he did not, would you consider that a violation of the chain of command? And Mr. Morrison says, I would consider it to be an unfortunate habit that he picked up from his prior boss, which in this case was Fiona Hill, I believe, because that was the predecessor to Mr. Morrison in his case. So Mr. Vindman apparently did not follow the proper chain of command, which is funny because I was told he's like this, great military guy, right? And if they know anything, they know the chain of command. He apparently went around it, told people outside of the NSC who had no business knowing about it, even though he claims that it was all on a need to know. But then again, he also claims that he doesn't know the identity of the whistleblower, and we're about to find out in a few minutes here that that's all bullshit. So we've got Morrison getting questioned. He has no direct knowledge of any sort of quid pro quo. The only knowledge he has of anything vaguely resembling one is the one that Ambassador Sondland took it upon himself to present to Yermak, who was the advisor to the Ukrainian president. And then later on, he is asked by John Ratcliffe, by Castor, the GOP counsel Castor, if during the vice president's meeting with President Zelensky, any of these things came up, because surely if this was like a big time thing that everyone in the White House was in on, that the vice president would have went over there and said, hey, Burisma, hey, CrowdStrike, hey, Biden. None of those things were discussed at any point during the meeting with President Zelensky, according to Mr. Morrison. Then we get John Ratcliffe beginning to lay the groundwork for the shaky credibility of Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, and we'll get into a little bit more of the fine detail on that. But the mere fact that he went outside of the chain of command and he didn't report to Tim Morrison what he clearly should have reported starts to immediately bring into question the credibility of his testimony, and there's more on that a little later on. But then there was like the big day on the Hill, the first day of testimony. You had George Kent, you had Bill Taylor, neither of which were on the call, so that neither of them have any idea what was physically said on the call any more than you and I do. We all know because we've read the transcript, or at least I have, and there's nothing in there that suggests bribery, quid pro quo, or any specific investigations for political purposes. He does ask about some investigations based on 2016 election meddling, which is very real and very worthy of study. If, in fact, we were so concerned about Russian meddling, why wouldn't we be as concerned about Ukrainian meddling, China meddling, Saudi Arabian meddling, any other country, literally any country other than the United States of America that's trying to influence our election? We should be looking into it, and the Ukraine is no different. Number two, neither of these men have ever met the president before, yet they seem to be able to read his mind, and both are asked point blank throughout the course of this testimony, I believe by John Ratcliffe. He says, are either of you here to provide evidence of any impeachable offense, and neither of them provide any such evidence, even when asked point blank. Number 3, Bill Taylor is supposedly according to him, he's a self-proclaimed expert on Ukraine, yet he didn't seem to know anything about Biden's son working for Burisma, one of the largest private natural gas producers in Ukraine, even though this has been something that the State Department and the Obama political campaign had looked into due to the optics of Hunter Biden working for a foreign company on a board that he clearly was not qualified to be working on, and for that matter, that his father was working in the region with energy companies, of all things. Taylor was not only completely ignorant to all of this stuff, but seemed wholly incurious about it, and that in and of itself leads you to believe that Mr. Taylor is not quite the expert that he claims himself to be. Meanwhile, George Kent was sending letters to the Ukraine telling them not to prosecute certain people, and one of those confirmed people happened to be a gentleman by the name of Yuri Lutsenko. Now, Lutsenko just so happens to have been one of the people who helped the deep state collect unverified information on Paul Manafort in the form of the Black Ledger that is still yet to be verified, and just so happened to be a source for Fusion GPS to provide information for the now infamous, still to be verified Steele dossier, as was stated under oath by Nellie Orr, wife of FBI's Bruce Orr, who happened to be working with Fusion GPS at the time. She testified that Lutsenko was one of her sources when she was working for Fusion trying to build the dossier. So, you've got the RussiaGate scandal, the Russia stuff that never panned out. One of the people who was feeding information to Fusion GPS on behalf of Perkins Coie, on behalf of the DNC, on behalf of the Hillary Clinton campaign, was working with Fusion GPS. Lutsenko was working directly with Nellie Orr, who was the wife of Bruce Orr, who was like one of the top 5 people in the FBI at the time during this investigation. And the fact that those two are as close together as they are, I mean, they literally, one would assume, share a bed. And I can't imagine that the pillow talk about the Russian collusion hoax didn't come up at some point or another. They may very well have been able to debunk each other's nonsense, but clearly they were looking to prove each other's nonsense and to do it through these back channels, potentially even the pillow talk. So I actually have the letter from George Kent in the show notes this week. You can look at it. It shows that, Yuri Lutsenko is a former Ukrainian prosecutor who is being asked to not be investigated by the current Ukrainian prosecutor for corruption because, well, he's a friendly of Western deep staters, apparently. Fortunately for us, John Solomon has been doing some excellent work on this front. He has become public enemy number 1 amongst the journalists out there. If you Google his name, Google just pulls up every friggin' article hitting this guy and tearing him down. Just outright lies about the guy, and he's just been doing some spectacular work on the RussiaGate stuff. He's doing some spectacular work on the Ukraine stuff, which he actually kind of stumbled upon while doing the Russia stuff because it's all the same scandal. It's just different location, I guess. The same piece is being bandied about, both trying to accumulate the Russian information, which was never real to begin with, now trying to prove the Ukrainian information because Solomon and people of his ilk might just be getting too close to the fact that the Ukraine scandal is the Russia scandal, and it involves all the same players. In his article from The Hill, he wrote, Lutsenko told me he was stunned when the ambassador gave me a list of people whom we should not prosecute. The list included a founder of the Anti-Corruption Action Center group, which is the ACAC, I guess, or the Anti-CAC group, and 2 members of parliament who vocally supported the group's anti-corruption reform agenda, according to the source directly familiar with the meeting. It turns out the group that Ukrainian law enforcement was probing was co-founded by the Obama administration and liberal mega donor George Soros. Weird. And it was collaborating with the FBI agents investigating then Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort's business activities with pro-Russian figures in Ukraine. Later on in the article, Lutsenko suggested the embassy applied pressure because it did not want Americans to see who was being funded with its tax dollars. at the time, Miss Ambassador, this was Marie Yovanovitch, thought our interviews of the Ukrainian citizens and of Ukrainian civil servants were frequent visitors to the U.S. Embassy would cast a shadow on that anti-corruption policy, Solomon said. Which is funny, because I thought that she, Marie Yovanovitch, was this undeniable force against corruption, and here it is. It seems that she's quite clearly trying to cover up corruption because she's worried about optics, which seems to be something that is, it's a trend in the Obama administration. They're far less worried about facts and data and actually just doing the right thing, and far more worried about optics. Her entire opening statement in her 11:15 open-air testimony was all about how we needed to root out corruption in Ukraine, which is exactly what Trump was trying to do on the infamous July 25th call, and how crucial she was going to be in making that happen. More on her in a bit. But let's get back to Solomon here, who goes on to say Kent's letter, because we're talking about George Kent, one of the witnesses from the first day of the hearings. Kent's letter unequivocally shows the embassy did press Ukrainian prosecutors to back off what normally would be considered an internal law enforcement matter inside a sovereign country. And more than half a dozen U.S. and Ukrainian sources confirmed to meet the ANT-AC, the Anti-Corruption Action Center case, wasn't the only one in which American officials exerted pressure on the Ukrainian investigators in 2016. And this, of course, leads us back to the root of all evil, no, not money, George Soros. Okay, I added that last line in there, but we move on to the actual article. It says, after the Obama Justice Department launched its Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative a decade ago to prosecute corruption in other countries, the State Department, Justice Department, and FBI outsourced some of its work in Ukraine to groups funded by Soros. Crazy. The Hungarian-American businessman is one of the world's largest donors to American liberal causes, a champion of the U.S. kleptocracy crackdown, and a man with extensive business interests in Ukraine. One key U.S. partner was ANT-AC, which is, again, that Anti-Corruption Action Center, which received 59%, or $1 million of its nearly $1.7 million budget since 2012 from U.S. budgets tied to state and justice, and nearly $290,000 from sources International Renaissance Foundation, according to the group's donor disclosure records. So, it appears we have the Soroses funding some of this movement, this ANT-AC, this Anti-Corruption Action Center over there, and the other portion, much larger portion of the funding, is actually coming from our tax dollars, because the Obama administration set up what is called the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative, which is, ironically enough, set up to prosecute corruption in other countries, which is actually what Trump was asking Zelensky to do on that call. It seems as if that's almost part of the job and not something that he just willy-nilly decided to do on his own for political gain. Anyway, so that's George Kent. He's involved in all of that nonsense, along with Marie Yovanovitch. They are actively, all these people are up on the stand talking about we need to, there are some serious corruption concerns in Ukraine, but Donald Trump was going about it for political reasons. Well, it seems to me that a lot of these people are part of the corruption apparatus in and around Ukraine, and maybe they don't want Trump digging so deeply because they might get found out. Even though they're very loose-lipped on the stand here, it's almost like they think they're so convinced they're doing the right thing that they refuse to believe that they'll ever be held accountable for what is clearly, and in a lot of cases, unequivocally, the wrong thing. And I don't want to forget about Bill Taylor. He was the other half of the testimony that particular day. Let's get into Bill here. I'm actually going to let him speak for himself because he's about as damning as I possibly could be if I tried. He was being questioned again by GOP counselor Castor, and he was asked about a conversation that he had, Bill Taylor that is, with President Zelensky of Ukraine. And this was the day after the infamous call, and here is what Bill Taylor had to say about that.
You were with President Zelensky the very next day?
We were. We had a meeting with him the very next day.
And did President Zelensky raise any concerns about his views of the call?
He said, Ambassador Volker Ambassador Sondland were in his office, and we asked him, I think, how the call. He said call was fine. I was happy with the call.
He was happy with the call. Certainly doesn't sound like a guy who was just blackmailed, was it? Now, and another thing worth noting, the reason I played the audio for you there is just listen to how skeptical he is to answer the question right away. I mean, he knows Zelensky told him he was happy with the call and that the call was fine. Yet it took him like 10 seconds to get that out because he was trying to come up with a better way of saying it when he obviously couldn't, because there's no way of sugarcoating the truth. It's just the truth. It shines brighter than any sun. It's all you got to do is just say what he said there, Bill. And he was hesitant to say it because he knows just how damning the words from Zelensky are to the Democrat case. And Bill Taylor's not there as a moderate, as an unbiased witness. Everybody who's being called up are being called up because the Democrats are convinced that they are going to make their case. And there's a litany of witnesses that were not allowed to go up and testify because the Republicans had requested them, and the Democrats, who have complete and utter control over this phase of the impeachment hearings, have denied those witnesses. Now, when we get to the Senate, they're not going to be able to deny those witnesses because they're going to be submitted, and it's going to run like a normal court, basically, a normal trial. And unfortunately, Chief Justice Roberts will preside over all of them, which is just a damn shame because he might as well just be a Democrat himself. He is just so terrible. He was one of the worst picks in the history of the Supreme Court for Republicans, I got to say. But he's still got a few chances coming up here to make up for himself. So hopefully he stops reading all the op-eds about him and starts just actually interpreting the Constitution to the letter of the law. So Bill Taylor and George Kent, these were their first big day one open air testimony witnesses, and neither of them provided anything. Again, John Ratcliffe asked both of them point blank, are either of you here to provide us with any evidence of any impeachable offenses? And the two of them just like shoulder shrugged, like, Shaggy. It was like one of those moments. It was really, really bad. Let's get to Marie Yovanovitch. I mentioned her before. She wasn't even our ambassador at the time when the call took place. She was literally there on the stand testifying. Again, I'm using on the stand more colloquially than literally. She was literally there, though, because she cried during her closed-door testimony, and the Dems wanted to have like a Christine Blasey Ford moment on this testimony because they don't deal in facts, they deal in emotions. And in this particular case, Marie Yovanovitch was their big emotional card that they were going to try to pull because she's got the sads, guys. She's really sad that she got fired. And it's not just me who's saying this. This actually came from Representative Lee Zeldin, Republican representative from the state of New York. He said, and I quote, "The reason why that 45 minutes was spent with her getting asked questions about her feelings is because House Democrats wanted to recreate what happened in the disposition," which was the closed-door hearings, Zeldin said. "They wanted her to cry for the cameras. It's unfortunate." End quote. Now, why did she cry? She was fired. Obviously, that's not great. No one wants that news. But it doesn't really matter why she was fired because she serves at the pleasure of the president, and the president decided that he didn't want her serving at his pleasure anymore and got rid of her. But the Democrats seem to forget that there was also several allegations of her speaking privately and repeatedly about her disdain for the current administration in a way that might call for her expulsion. And this is former Representative Pete Sessions had written a letter to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo letting him know just that from the letter. Is that she had, quote, spoken privately and repeatedly about her disdain for the current administration in a way that might call for the expulsion, end quote. Now, frankly, again, it doesn't matter why she was fired because she serves at the pleasure of the president, and Donald Trump can say, he could wake up one morning on the wrong side of the bed and say, I'm getting rid of all the ambassadors. I don't need a reason. They serve at my pleasure. I could just say, and they're gone. And so she's gone. But she was really upset because she was apparently fired because of lies, because she denies the claims from former Representative Pete Sessions. But again, it's really irrelevant as to what the ultimate underlying reason was for her being fired. The president has every right to fire her. And for that matter, once more, she was fired before this call took place. So she provides literally nothing of substance for any sort of impeachable offenses that occurred in or around this particular phone call with the president of Ukraine. And a funny thing that just so happened to be accomplished by her testimony, though, this is not something that the Democrats were looking forward to, is the debunking of a media myth that Trump hasn't been hard on Russia. And I'm going to read from her testimony here. She's again being asked questions and answering them. So the question is, can you testify to the difference the changes in aid to Ukraine with the new administration starting in 2017? The different initiatives, as far as providing lethal weapons and before the questioner is even given the ability to finish their question, she responds, yeah, well, I think that most of the assistance programs that we had, continued, and due to the generosity of the Congress actually were increased. And so that was a really positive thing, I think, for Ukraine and for us. In terms of lethal assistance, we all felt it was very significant that this administration made the decision to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine. And she was asked, did you advocate for that? And she said, yes. And he says, did you advocate for that in the prior administration back in 2016? And she said, well, yeah. So let this be a reminder, 1,349,522 that President Trump was harder on Russia than President Obama was, because Obama took a nap while Russia decided to just sneak in overnight and annex Crimea from Ukraine and provided them with blankets and, menial aid. Meanwhile, Donald Trump gets elected, steps into office, and was like, I'm going to give you guys the means to defend yourselves. Because as an advocate for the Second Amendment, I'm sure that sort of correlates over to the foreign realm as well, as he wants to give Ukraine the right to defend themselves against Russian aggression. And so instead of sending them blankets and bottles of water, he sent them missiles, because that's what you need to fend off the Russians. And so Marie Yovanovitch accidentally debunked the Democrat media talking point, and that is that Trump is not as hard on Russia as Obama, because the reality is it went the other way around, folks. And that brings me to the esteemed Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who is the guy who kind of was the first big marquee witness. He was the first one to really come forward and be like, I had issues with this transcript, because once the transcript was released, which was something I'm sure the Democrats were not anticipating the White House doing, the conversation was out there for everybody to read. So whatever the whistleblower had to say was pretty much irrelevant, because we could read the actual conversation. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman was the first person to come forward and say, no, I had issues with the transcript. I had corrections I wanted to make. Burisma was specifically mentioned on that phone call, and I wanted to make sure that that was corrected. Now, he provided those corrections up the chain of command like he was supposed to with the previous information that he didn't tell Tim Morrison, and he was denied because there was other people on the call, and none of them heard what he heard. Mind you, he was there to testify recently with Michelle Williams, I believe. So it was Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Michelle Williams. They were the two people on the stand that particular day. Again, stand, colloquial, whatever. Both of them agreed that the original transcript, which was released to the public, was substantively correct. So there goes the Democrat narrative that the transcript that we're all reading is not a real transcript, that it's not a word-for-word transcript, that this, that, and the other thing. Even Vindman, once he was under oath and had to testify, agreed to the fact that the transcript was substantively correct, which means that it was pretty much exactly the way the conversation went, even though Vindman supposedly had all these issues and all these corrections that he wanted to make that he thought made a substantial difference to the phone call. Henceforth, he wanted them put in there. But once he was asked under oath, he said no. They are substantively correct. That transcript is, in effect, almost exactly word for word, and nothing of substance was left out of it. Anyway, then you got Williams, who said that she didn't know why the military aid was being held up, which is funny because the only reason we're even here is that Adam Schiff is positive that the aid was being held up because Trump wanted Ukraine to investigate Biden. That and only that. So if she has no information as to why the military aid was held up, she most certainly doesn't have affirmation that the military aid was being held up in exchange for an investigation into the Burisma, into the Bidens. And so what is she doing there? What are either of them doing there? He had corrections to a transcript that no one else felt were necessary and were denied. He was even caught later trying to make changes to the transcript, which is a whole nother story that I don't really have a ton of facts on. I mean, I just don't have the full verification on that, but there apparently was a story that came out after the fact, after the testimony, where he was seen going to go read this document and potentially make changes to it, which is a little frightening. Also, when it comes down to Vindman, he has to know who this whistleblower is. He has to know who the whistleblower is because he tells the committee at one point that he only told 2 people outside of the NSC, one of which he named and the other one he wouldn't name. And when the Republicans started asking questions about the unnamed person, immediately Adam Schiff, who also supposedly doesn't know who the whistleblower is, even though his staff are the only people who've actually talked to him, he starts banging the gavel. No, we're not going to out the whistleblower. We're not going to out the whistleblower. What do you mean we're not going to out the whistleblower? You don't know who the whistleblower is. How is it possible that we're going to out the whistleblower? Here's Jim Jordan making that case.
Yes, Mr. Jordan, on call readout, certainly after the first call, there were probably a half a dozen or more people that I read out. Those are people with the proper clearance and the need to know. In this case, because of the sensitivity of the call and Mr. Eisenberg told me not to speak to anybody else, I only read out, outside of the NSC, 2 individuals.
2 individuals.
Das Kent and one other person.
And you're not willing to tell us who that other individual is?
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
The gentleman will suspend. Counsel. Mr. Chairman, I would ask you to enforce the rule with regard to disclosure, with regard to the intelligence office.
Thank you, counsel. You know, as I indicated before, this committee will not be used to out the whistleblower. That same
Mr. Chairman,
necessity
can you first stop the time so I don't lose the time?
Will persist. You are recognized again, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chairman, I don't see how this is outing the whistleblower. The witness has testified in his deposition that he doesn't know who the whistleblower is. You have said, even though no one believes you, you have said you don't know who the whistleblower is. So how is this outing the whistleblower to find out who this individual is?
Mr. Jordan, this is your time for questioning. You can use it any way you like, but your question should be addressed to the witness. And your question should not be addressed to trying to out the whistleblower.
Well, okay.
If no one knows who the whistleblower is, how could you possibly know which questions might potentially out the whistleblower? It defies logic. And the fact that this is allowed to go on and waste valuable time and taxpayer dollars, it's a crime. This is criminal. This should be... I don't even know. Everyone involved in these hoaxes should be charged with something by the end of this. Obstruction of justice, perhaps. I don't know. By continuing to attempt to inflict non-existent justice upon people for crimes they didn't commit and wasting all the time and energy that they wasted on this sort of stuff. I don't want to go as far as to say it's treason, but maybe. Maybe it is. All of them need to go. They all need to be held accountable at a bare minimum. They need to be voted out of office, and that means that we're going to have to do a whole lot of deprogramming of their liberal voter base because they're all just too stupid and stuck in their ways to break from the conditioning that they've been beaten over the head with since grade school and now via the social mediums, I suppose, and the media as a whole. One more thing on Vindman before we put this whole thing to bed. He was apparently... not the most credible person, even amongst the circles that he rolled in the intelligence community, as Fiona Hill, the former deputy assistant to the president and senior director of European and Russian affairs for the National Security Council, passed off her role, which was ultimately taken by Tim Morrison, who we talked about earlier. Apparently, Miss Hill had expressed some concerns about the credibility of Mr. Vindman, specifically informing Mr. Morrison that she had some doubts about Colonel Vindman's judgment, that he may potentially be a leaker, that he did not keep his bosses in the loop on what he was doing, and in fact went around his bosses' backs on occasion, and he was mad that he was cut out of working on Ukraine, which is, I believe, where his nationality. I don't want to say he's from the Ukraine, but I guess that's where his family's from. He speaks Ukrainian. He thinks he's some sort of expert on the Ukraine, as apparently all of these idiots do. And yes, I know I keep calling it the Ukraine. It's just a form of habit. There's just not a whole lot I'm going to be able to do about it in the moment here. That brings me over to Miss Hill herself, who was also testifying. She literally resigned from the position that she had, the former deputy assistant to the president and senior director for European and Russian affairs on his National Security Council. She literally resigned from that position 6 days before the infamous phone call to the Ukraine. So again, she has nothing of substance to talk about regarding the call or impeachable offenses, which makes her no different than any of the other witnesses up to this point. But alas, here she is on the Hill testifying. She did manage to expose the Russian collusion narrative a little bit here, both in her opening testimony as well as her closed-door testimony. We got an article in the show notes from the Daily Caller's Chuck Ross, who entitled Fiona Hill, Russians Could Have Played Christopher Steele. And this is actually kind of interesting because this falls into a narrative that I've been talking about for a while. I've definitely been tweeting about it for a while. I've been reading up on Spygate so much, is that Christopher Steele, the guy who was getting information for Fusion GPS on behalf of Perkins Coie Law Firm, on behalf of Hillary Clinton's campaign, he was a legitimate FBI informant. He worked on the FIFA case, all this sort of stuff. But when he met with the State Department just about 8 days before the FISA warrants were taken out on Carter Page, he told the State Department's Kathleen Kavalek that his sources were Russians. Trubnikov and Surkov, I believe, were their names. And so, Fiona Hill proposes that the ever-wise Christopher Steele and all of his MI6ery could have been fooled by these Russian sources who were, in and of themselves, Russian misinformation artists and operatives. From the article. In that interview, Hill told lawmakers she was shocked to learn that Steele was the author of the dossier. She also said that he was vulnerable to potential Russian disinformation because he was constantly trying to drum up business in the numerous meetings that he had had while she was a scholar at the Brookings Institution. Hill said she last met Steele in 2016 and that she was not aware at the time that he was investigating Trump. She also explicitly stated that Russians might have fed Steele with disinformation in order to put a cloud over an eventual Trump presidency. Voila. Somebody who finally is putting some of this stuff together, who isn't a complete and utter partisan hack. Fiona Hill appears to just kind of know what's going on over there. That said, she does go a little bit off the rails in a little bit when she does refer to Ukrainian interference in the election as a fictional narrative. Now, this couldn't be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, I'm looking at an article right here. 2017 Politico article, Ukrainian efforts to sabotage Trump backfire. In this article, which is still up on their website, with no corrections, no retractions, and Politico is still standing by the story, it just so happens to be the tip of the iceberg. Another thing worth note as far as Ukrainian election collusion is that the Ukrainian ambassador at the time had wrote an article, an op-ed in The Hill about how much he disagreed with Donald Trump's foreign policy proposals. This is a Ukrainian ambassador, not our ambassador to the Ukraine, a Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, writing in an American paper on an American website about how much he disagrees with Donald Trump's foreign policy proposals during the election. Now, I mean, that seems a lot like foreign election interference to me. I don't know. Call me crazy. And it's pretty open and brazen, too, the fact that you're just writing articles. You didn't give a quote to a journalist. No, you put your name on the byline and wrote an article about how much you disagree with Trump's foreign policy during a presidential election. Anyway, later on in the Chuck Ross article, the Daily Caller article I pointed out before, she says, the point that actually hasn't come out, and again, why I've been very cross in the media, is that the president was attacked as well, because the Russians sought to discredit him, Hill said. There's been a cloud over President Trump since the beginning of his presidency, and I think that's exactly what the Russians intended, she said later. And that was during her closed-door testimony. In her open testimony, she stated, the Russians' interests are frankly to delegitimize our entire presidency. She later says, so one issue that I do want to raise, and I think this would resonate with our colleagues on the committee from the Republican Party, is that the goal of the Russians was really to put whoever became the president by trying to tip their hand on one side of the scale under a cloud. Yes, the Russians were obviously messing with our election. No one seriously could possibly think otherwise. As a matter of fact, if 2015 rolled around, let's go back before this election, 2012, if I put a gun to your head and said, do you think the Russians are interfering in the election? Any sane person would be like, yeah, probably, because that's kind of what they do. We've known this forever, and yet for some reason, when it happened when Donald Trump won the presidency, it somehow was this cataclysmic, world-shifting, election-bending, meddling, conspiracy, like it's this whole nonsense of just Mod Podge buzzwords that they throw out there onto headlines and onto chyrons and to try to get you convinced that obviously the Russians were involved in the election, Trump won the election, no one saw the latter coming, so the former must be to blame. It's just nonsense. It's a false equivalence. It's poor logic. But then again, we're dealing with Democrats here. I can't say I'm all that surprised. Let's move on to another one of their big witnesses, David Holmes, counselor for political affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine. Now, CNN seems to think that this is the big fish. CNN headline, witness overheard U.S. ambassador tell Trump that Ukraine would investigate Biden. Okay. No one's denying that Trump had asked them to investigate Biden. No one's denying that Trump withheld foreign aid. What we're denying is the fact that those two things were dependent on one another. The aid ultimately got released. The investigation never took place. No White House meeting ever took place. Yada, yada, yada. There was no deal, because every deal that they've tried to define didn't happen as they claim it happened. So yes, David Holmes apparently overheard Trump asking Ambassador Sondland about Ukraine and about whether or not they're doing the elections. No one is denying that Trump was interested in them investigating corruption, and that corruption just so happens to involve Hunter Biden, and the Ukraine also happened to have interfered in our 2016 election and could very well interfere in the 2020 election. So he's just trying to make sure everything's on the up and up over there. That's anti-corruption, true anti-corruption, unlike the media and Marie Yovanovitch and all these other fools. From the CNN article, and I quote, Sondland told Trump that Zelensky loves your ass, Holmes said, according to a copy of his opening statement. Then I heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation? Ambassador Sondland replied, he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to. Now, it sounds an awful lot more like Zelensky is just really, really willing to do just about anything to please President Trump, more so than President Trump is forcing Zelensky to do anything via quid pro quos or ultimatums or bribery or extortion, whatever fancy word you want to use that you think your voting populace will figure out. Later in that very article, in his statement, Holmes also added details about the freezing of U.S. security aid to Ukraine, though he didn't have direct knowledge about the reason behind the holdup, and he detailed concerns being raised from multiple officials about Giuliani. Okay, so they don't like having to work with Rudy. Tough noogies, okay? Run for president, win, and then you can select whomever you'd like to be in charge of foreign policy. Until that time, Donald Trump gets to make those decisions, and he chooses Rudy Giuliani to help him out with Ukraine in particular, because Rudy's been over there doing investigations for years ahead of this, because he knows that a lot of the corruption building up to the 2016 election, a lot of the corruption related to some of these fake documents that apparently came out of the Ukraine or came from sources related to the Ukraine in some way, shape, or form. Rudy knows all this. That's why he's over there. Trump is interested in investigating corruption in the Ukraine. Rudy has become a bit of an expert on it at this point, so he's over there helping out in terms of enacting Trump's foreign policy. Again, if you don't like it, David Holmes, hand in your resignation, run for president, win, and then you can conduct foreign policy however you'd like. But that's not, that they add the Rudy thing in there like there's anything illegal going on there. There's nothing illegal going on there. They just don't like Rudy the same way Marie Yovanovitch didn't like being fired, and the same way that Lieutenant Colonel Vindman just doesn't like President Trump's foreign policy. It's a lot of feelings. It's no facts. And as we all know, facts do not care about your feelings. I may have stolen that from somebody. I don't know where. Anyway, so the GOP did manage to get one witness in here. It's Kurt Volker, and this is actually a really, really simple one to go through, so I'm just going to touch on this real quick. Representative Mike Turner from Ohio asked him, and this is in relation to President Trump. He's asking Kurt Volker, did he ever say to you that he was not going to allow aid with the U.S. to go to Ukraine unless there was an investigation into Burisma, the Bidens, or the 2016 election. Kurt Volker replied, no, he did not. And if that's not enough for you, here's GOP Counselor Castor with a bit more direct line of questioning. And let me go ahead and get that clip for you here.
Mr. Zeldin asked you in the deposition that in no way, shape, or form in either readouts from the United States or Ukraine did you receive any indication whatsoever for anything that resembled a quid pro quo. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the same would go for this new allegation of bribery?
I've only seen an allegation of bribery in the last week.
It's the same common set of facts. It's just instead of quid pro quo, now it's bribery.
I was never involved in anything that I considered to be bribery at all.
Okay, or extortion?
Or extortion.
Okay.
I gotta say, I love how the Republicans are having fun with this. Obviously, Counsel Castor has been having a ball with this, asking some of the most inane, straightforward, obvious questions that apparently no one on the Democratic side felt the need to ask or was even remotely curious of what the answer might be. The Republicans are so convinced that there's nothing going on here, they're just straight up asking. So, you didn't hear anything about a quid pro quo, did you? That's correct. Then what are you here for? I mean, that should be the follow-up question to every one of these things is, why are you here? And on some occasions, I believe Ratcliffe actually asked somebody that at some point. But it's just, if these folks don't have direct evidence of a quid pro quo, I don't know why they're even being called to the stand. These folks, the Democrats, Adam Schiff, this whole stupid committee, everyone pushing this impeachment narrative, they had made the case that Donald Trump definitely 100% withheld military aid, which on its face is not illegal, but that he had specifically done it for political means, which is kind of hilarious because while Biden is the front runner, I don't think anyone actually thinks Biden's going to actually be the candidate by the time we get to the end of all this. And there's no way Trump could know that unless he actually is a time traveler, which opens up a whole nother set of doors. But that the military aid was being withheld specifically and only for Mr. Trump, President Trump's political gain. And that if there was literally any other explanation for it, like Trump's natural hesitance towards foreign aid, or the fact that there is a lot of corruption going on in the Ukraine that every one of these witnesses seems to agree upon, these are other reasons that might they benefit Donald Trump? Sure, there's a lot of stuff that he does as the president that might benefit him, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't benefit the country or the world. He's not the president of the world. He's the president of the United States of America. But we do have partnerships with other countries. They help us. We help them. And in order for them to continue to help us, we need to continue to help them. It's almost like foreign policy as a whole is a quid pro quo. And if you followed foreign policy at all, you know that to be the case. But they think that this is a special one. This is a special quid pro quo. This is something unlike we've ever seen before. Donald Trump is targeting his political opponents via foreign governments. It's almost like he took this trick directly out of the playbook of the Obama administration, who did exactly that. Neither here nor there at the moment. Let's get down to the big one, because this is the whoa, we've got him now witness that everybody was gung-ho about. Ambassador Gordon Sondland. You've heard me mention his name a bunch of times. I'm sure you're wondering why I haven't talked about his testimony yet. Well, because there's literally only one section of the testimony that you need to hear, unfortunately. I found the clip, and I'm going to play it for you right now.
But I believe I just asked him an open-ended question, Mr. Chairman. What do you want from Ukraine? I keep hearing all these different ideas and theories and this and that. What do you want? And it was a very short, abrupt conversation. He was not in a good mood. And he just said, I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing. Something to that effect.
Now, Sondland would actually later go on, because he had originally stated, yes, there was a quid pro quo. But then he obviously just testified there that Donald Trump at no point in time told him that he wanted a quid pro quo. So Sondland actually said, I presumed that there was one because, again, there was some military aid being held up. There were some questions about corruption. He thought the two were tied, but at no point in time did anyone directly tell him that, yes, these two things are tied. He presumed, not a fact, more of a feeling, which is, again, all the Democrats have. And there you have it, the impeachment hoax. No one, not a single one of these people who I've listed up to this moment in time has any evidence of a quid pro quo, bribery, ultimatum, extortion, deal, anything, that would be anywhere near an impeachable offense, because even if there had been a quid pro quo, again, that's sort of how foreign policy works, is that we give you stuff and no one gives anything away for free, right? So we're giving foreign aid to countries. We ask them to abide by a certain set of rules or standards or laws or guidelines in order for us to release the military aid. What Trump did here is in no way different than any of those other things, but they are specifically hammering on this one as if this is the end of the world. This is almost like if Donald Trump sold 20% of our uranium to Russia. Oh, wait. Yeah, that was the previous administration. Never mind. Anyway, so if there were some lies that I didn't manage to cover up to this point in the show, luckily for me, Devin Nunes has got me covered, and I'm going to go ahead and play his little tirade. This is his opening remarks from November 20th, 2019 during the impeachment hearings, and here is Mr. Nunes laying it all out there, just the way I like to do every week. He managed to do it in a much shorter form than my 2-hour-plus podcast, but here's Devin Nunes sweeping up all the other lies that I might have missed as I was dancing through this landmine of liberal lies to put together this show.
New York Times. Trump campaign aides had repeated contacts with Russian intelligence. Also false. Slate was a Trump server communicating with Russia. This was false. New York Magazine. Will Trump be meeting with his counterpart or his handler? This was false. The Guardian. Manafort held secret talks with Assange and Ecuadorian embassy. Also false. BuzzFeed. President Trump directed his attorney to lie to Congress about the Moscow Tower project. All of these were false. There was no objectivity or fairness in the media's Russia stories, just as a fevered rush to tarnish and remove a president who refuses to pretend that the media are something different from what they really are, puppets of the Democratic Party.
And this is why Devin Nunes is another one of the people that is routinely lambasted on Twitter and in the media and on every other kind of social media. If it's not Twitter, they're going after the people that are getting close. John Solomon, Devin Nunes, Jim Jordan, Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani was at one point America's mayor, right? Like, I mean, you don't need to love him. You don't need to, maybe you didn't like some of his policies or whatever the case may be. The guy was a beloved mayor of New York City. Everyone in the country loved him. He was America's mayor. He was the guy who stepped up when we needed somebody to step up after 9/11. And he, in addition to getting rid of a lot of the crime in the city, he obviously was a good leader in a time of need. People loved Rudy Giuliani. Now, not so much, shockingly. People all of a sudden hate the guy because he's affiliated with Donald Trump. It just seems to be a pattern. But that's it, man. That's it for the impeachment stuff. Like I said, all of those witnesses, everyone I named, Tim Morrison, Gordon Sondland, David Holmes, Vindman, Williams, Hill, none of them had anything substantive in any way, shape, or form that will push the Democrats closer to the impeachment that they ever so desperately want. And it's just pure and utter nonsense at this point. But the lies do extend well beyond the impeachment. And yes, I do have a few more for you before I send you home. Let's start here with the Agent Free Press over in France. I believe this is the AFP, which I believe is an affiliate of the AP. But the AFP apparently withdrew a story about immigration. The headline read, "Breaking, more than 100,000 children in migration-related U.S. detention, according to the UN." Now, why did the AFP pull this story, you might ask? Well, they didn't pull it because it was factually inaccurate. They could have corrected it because it was factually inaccurate. They pulled it because it pulled back the curtain on a narrative that they did not want to pull back the curtain on. Tweet from AFP. AFP is withdrawing the story. The author of the report has clarified that his figures do not represent the number of children currently in migration-related U.S. detention, but the total number of children in migrated-related U.S. detention in 2015. We will delete the story. Not correct it. Delete it. Why? Why are they deleting it? Who was president in 2015? It wasn't Trump. It wasn't Bush, right? Who was that other guy? Obama. The guy who we were told, even though every picture that the media continues to use in all their stories about kids in cages came from his time in office, we were told that no, not Barack Obama. He would never put kids in cages. Fact check. He kind of started it. It really started becoming a regular thing under his administration. All the pictures you see of kids in cages on like the headlines and the tweets, good chance that those pictures were taken during the Obama administration. And again, notice they didn't correct the story. They didn't fix the story. They didn't, change the headline. They just got rid of it. They eviscerated it from the internet because it said something bad about Barack Obama. And that is lying by omission, quite literally. Also, narrative seems to be going around since he was appointed as our Attorney General that Bill Barr is a Trump puppet, which is funny because according to the New York Magazine headline, Attorney General William Barr refused to publicly state that Trump did nothing illegal in Ukraine call, according to a report. Well, I was told that he's a Trump puppet and that he does everything Trump asks whenever Trump asks him to do it. So why wouldn't he get up in front of a microphone and say that Trump did nothing wrong? Even if Trump had done something wrong, I'm told that William Barr is a puppet of the Trump administration and he does everything that Trump says, no matter what, whether it's the right thing to do or not. Seems sort of fishy that when Trump asked him to do something, he didn't do it. It's almost like he actually thinks independently and actually cares about the law. Unlike the fools on the media and on social media and up on the Hill who are constantly and perpetually attacking him, despite the fact that they didn't even learn the golden rule, nonetheless, U.S. law as a whole. Anyway, so he's not a puppet, clearly. Also, why didn't he do that? It's not because Trump did anything wrong. It's because we've been there before. Remember that whole press conference where William Barr was standing in front of the press telling everybody there was no obstruction of justice and no one believed him? No one believed him. Furthermore, people were espousing conspiracy theories that maybe because Rod Rosenstein was going along with it, that somebody in the Trump administration had done something to the Rosenstein family. Maybe the whole family was being tied to chairs in the living room in the Rosenstein manor, and Ivanka and Jared were there holding them hostage at gunpoint, perhaps even machete point. Who knows? Ivanka's crazy like that. I don't know what these people think. I have to try to dive deep into their delusions, and it's hard to come back out of. Also, Roger Stone. He obviously worked for InfoWars. He was tied to the Trump campaign at one point or another. Roger Stone lied about WikiLeaks, right? That's a big story that everybody heard. It looks like he's going to go to jail, may very well go to jail for the rest of his life. The problem is, and I've got an article in the show notes for you here, is that he didn't lie in the way that they're claiming that he lied. Roger Stone has been saying since the jump that he actually did have connections with WikiLeaks, that he did actually discuss this with members of the campaign, because Roger Stone is a grade A bullshit artist, the likes of which the left have only seen when they look in the mirror, and he was trying to pretend that he was a bigger deal than he actually was. He was trying to pretend that he brought down Hillary Clinton, that he was working with WikiLeaks to work with the Trump campaign, to do all the things that were done. Well, it turns out he lied about all that, and that he didn't actually have a back channel to WikiLeaks, and that he didn't actually work with the campaign closely about doing these sorts of things. And you can read it in the article that I have in the show notes there. But if you read every headline, it's Roger Stone lied about WikiLeaks. That in your head, if you've been following the story, you immediately go to, oh, well, that means that Trump must have actually known about the WikiLeaks, when in actuality what really happened is that Roger Stone never really knew about the WikiLeaks. The information that he had was largely public. He just happened to be a little bit ahead of the news cycle, which wasn't hard because they weren't really jumping on them as quickly as people on Reddit were, for instance. Last couple things. Let's get into Hollywood lies. Chrissy Teigen. Not that she's really Hollywood, because I don't think she's ever actually been in a movie. As a matter of fact, to my knowledge, she's just a talentless sack of breasticles who happens to be married to an insanely talented vocalist and nothing else. But Hollywood lies. Chrissy Teigen, right? She's like one of these vocal, obnoxious celebrities, her and her husband, John Legend. They're all over social media. They're all over red carpets talking down about the president. They don't like the kids in the cages, and they got their fifis hurt, and yada, yada. We get it. They're terrible people. But Chrissy Teigen fancies herself a feminist. However, she didn't appear to be a particular fan of one woman in general. That woman, of course, was Elise Stefanik, Republican representative who was taking part in these impeachment hearings and asking some really tough questions. What did Miss Stefanik, Representative Stefanik, get for her work? She got to trend all weekend, a couple of weekends ago, on social media under the hashtag Trashy Stefanik. So she's not wrong. She's not, conservative. She's not misguided. Nah, she's trashy. This is the way that the supposed feminists of Hollywood paint powerful women on the right who don't fall in line with their narrative. Is that they're not wrong, they're not stupid, they're not evil, they're downright trashy. Trashy? Can you think of a less feminist descriptor for a fellow woman? Trashy? Why? Because she's smarter than you and asks questions that you wouldn't even dream of asking because you wouldn't even dare question the official narrative because you're a talentless and worthless sack of human excrement. She's got nothing to offer the world other than, like I said, couple gifts upstairs, and frankly, there's a lot of those bouncing around out here. Okay, Chrissy Teigen isn't really presenting anything to the world that we couldn't otherwise find in an old rerun of Baywatch, and I guess she provides some sort of generic cutlery for Target or whatever it is. This is what happens when you're talentless and worthless but vocal, and people want to put your name on stuff for whatever reason. So Chrissy Teigen, the not so feminist, going after the first woman who stood in defiance of her and her narrative and calling her trashy. And then obviously all the leftists piling on top of that. The last thing I have for you here, and this is a big one. It's one of my favorite topics, the transgender, gender fluidity, all that sort of stuff. It's complete chaos. It's complete nonsense. There are two genders, two terms, two scoops. Just that's it. Those are the things. Dennis Prager was on Bill Maher's show recently, and he made the insinuation that there is a leftist narrative out there that men can menstruate, as he likes to call it. I personally don't like to pronounce the U, but I'm going to go with it here for the sake of quoting Mr. Prager appropriately. And everybody on the panel laughed at him. Bill Maher laughed at him. Ronan Farrow laughed at him. Ronan Farrow is one of the best investigative journalists in the country right now. He's the guy who uncovered the Weinstein scandal. He had no idea. Now, I'm here to tell you, folks, that they know. They know exactly what Mr. Prager was talking about. And for that matter, the Bill Maher audience is amongst the dumbest group of people on the face of the earth. Not necessarily the people who watch at home, but the people who go. These are the same people who laughed Ann Coulter out of the room for suggesting that Donald Trump could be the president. How's that looking now? I've seen that cut a million times, and nothing makes me happier. So Dennis Prager said that there's a leftist narrative out there that men can menstruate. He was laughed at. He provided some examples, and they laughed at those. I'm here to provide you with a few more, some to even back up what he claimed. There are now, in some college campuses across the country, tampons in men's rooms. Like a dispenser of tampons for men who might need them for some reason in a men's room. Bill Maher on his show poo-pooed this by, this must be some new thing where we put them in the men's rooms so that the women can tell their men to go get them for them. I don't know where he's ever been in his life where there wasn't a men's room and a women's room right next to one another. And, my girlfriend is just as capable of walking into a women's room and getting herself a tampon as I am walking into a men's room to get her a tampon, because, again, I don't need one because I'm a man and I don't menstruate. But this is a thing that's spread across multiple high-end college campuses, including Berkeley, which is the one that Prager had pointed out at the time. There's an article in the Daily Caller, from the Daily Caller in the show notes. You can learn a little bit more about that. Also, thecollegefix.com reported an Iowa State professor was reported to an administration for allowing students to say that only women can have abortions, which is obviously true because they're the only ones who can make babies, or at least the only ones who can gestate babies, I guess is probably the best way of putting it. Is that, obviously I can't have a baby, so I can't have an abortion. It's just the way it works. But apparently an Iowa State professor was reported to the administration for allowing students to say just that. And then, well, there's this.
Hey, Dad.
Yeah, bud?
I think I got my period.
Yeah, that's a young boy telling his father, I think I got my period. This is an actual commercial that exists out on YouTube that I actually had pop up like in an ad. This was like a real thing. This wasn't just like I went searching for it. It came up. It's called Menstruation. It's by a company called Thinks. I really don't know what the purpose of this ad is, if it's awareness or if it's to actually, push tampons on young men in hopes that they won't figure out they don't actually need them. Whatever it is, there was like a budget and an effort and a production staff that went into this commercial. Actual men had to pretend that their fake sons were actually having their periods, because this is the world that we live in now, and it is being perpetuated by people like Bill Maher, by people like Chrissy Teigen, by people like Adam Schiff, who for some reason have an allergy to the truth and reality, for that matter. It's not even that the truth. It's like they don't even live in the same world as you and I. I like to always say that there are two worlds. There's the one world where everything's fine and dandy. That's the one that most of us live in, where we live in the greatest country in the world that doesn't have, systemic racism and doesn't have, mass poverty. We do have poverty. We just don't have it anywhere near as bad as other places in the world. And to be impoverished here is way better than to be impoverished in other places where they don't have, not for nothing, I don't love these programs, but we have programs here to help you if you're in really, really dire straits here in the U.S. Other countries do not. We have first world problems, quite literally. And it's important to know that and to think about that and to keep it in the back of your head when you're being told by Democrats and by the media and by the idiots on Twitter that this is like a terrible time and a terrible country and a terrible place and this, that, and the other thing. These folks don't even have the slightest fucking inkling what terrible truly is. As a matter of fact, they would love nothing more than to turn our essential utopia into one of those terrible places, whether it be Scandinavia through the welfare and through the massive tax increases and the unified and socialized everything, or they want us to be more like China or like Venezuela or like Cuba. They seem to not realize where the real problems are in the world, and yet they seem to find every little minutia problem they could possibly find from what's going on here in, again, the greatest country in the history of ever. And again, I cannot stress to you enough how far apart we are from these folks. And I don't want to hurt anybody, right? Like I don't want to get down to like a civil war, because that's ultimately where this is heading if we don't, if we don't come together somehow. But we cannot allow these people to win under any circumstances, because they will ruin the greatest thing possibly ever invented, the American experiment, the United States of America. And it's unfortunate that this is where we find ourselves these days, but we've let more than enough of our colleagues, our friends, our companions, our family members, we've let more than enough of them be brainwashed by the mainstream media up to this point. And at the end of the day, it's just those people's opinions. And as I've stressed on this show, opinions are like assholes. Everybody's got one. But this asshole has the right opinion. And I thank you ever so much for joining me right here on therightopinion.podbean.com. I have been your host, Harrison Bergeron, and I will be back next month on the regular monthly episode, but I am going to try to get in, hopefully hopefully nothing too crazy happens in the next month, but hopefully we get like kind of a big story I think I can hit on and give you some content on. My thing is like, I don't want to pick up a news article and give you 5-minute clips on it. I want to be able to give you a litany of news articles and show you a pattern. And I hope I did that throughout the course of this show here with all of the different lies that I've debunked along the way. And I want to be able to give you real substantive stuff. Like, I don't want to give you just regular news coverage stuff. That's not what I do here. I do the right opinion. I give you my opinion, which is based in fact and not in emotion. And I want to be able to tie together various lies and various misconceptions being perpetuated by the mainstream media and show you the pattern that they're using so that you can then identify it for yourselves and you can be more aware. And then hopefully we can spread this sumbitch out to the point to where maybe we start winning our country back. And that's it. Like I said, follow us here at therightopinion.podbean.com. Follow me on Twitter at rightopinionpod. Feel free to email the show, therightopinionpod@gmail.com. My apologies to whoever therightopinion@gmail.com may be. They got about half of my show notes for the month because I kept sending them to myself through my email, and I realized that I was not putting the pod on at the end. So if you email the show, therightopinionpod@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter, rightopinionpod, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes and Podbean for now, at least. I believe Google Play will have it up as well, but it's therightopinion.podbean.com. And if you just follow my Twitter, you get the monthly posts. I'll put it up there. I'll sticky it to my bio there, and for that matter, all of my other commentaries as live news is rolling out there. I'm sitting there, I'm watching the trends all day, and when something pops up, then I think I got to put my 2 cents in. I go ahead and I cram 3 cents in there because I got a little extra for their ass over on the left because they need it desperately. But again, that's it. therightopinion.podbean.com, at rightopinionpod, therightopinionpod@gmail.com. And I've got one more song for you as you go out the door, but let me reiterate to you once more that opinions are like assholes. Everybody's got one, but this asshole has the right opinion right here at therightopinion.podbean.com. Enjoy my rendition of Willy Wonka's Pure Imagination as you're heading out the door, and be sure to come back next month and follow me on Twitter and all that good stuff that I've already mentioned a couple times. I will talk to you guys next time. Peace.
Come with me and you'll be in a world where they'll impeach a nation. Take a look and you'll see into the left's imagination. We'll begin with a spin of the Democrat media creation. What we've seen has defied explanation. If you want to screw America, simply cast a vote for the blue kids. Anything they want to, they do it. They want to change the world, but